German generals laughed at US logistics until the Red Ball Express fueled Patton's Blitz opening, the German Miscalculation, August 19, 1944. Wehrmacht headquarters, East Prussia. General Alfred Jodl reviewed the latest intelligence from the collapsing Western Front. His staff had done the math. Allied supply lines now stretched over 400 miles from Normandy beaches to Patton's advancing Third Army. The Americans have outrun their logistics, Jodl announced confidently. Patton will stop within days, maybe hours. No army can keep moving this fast without fuel. From his position at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters, Jodl was certain of his calculations. Every German general knew from hard experience an armoured division consumed 150,000 gallons of fuel daily when attacking. The Americans were now 400 miles from their supply depots. The math was simple and brutal. Patton's Third Army would grind to a halt, giving the Wehrmacht time to regroup at the Seine. Maybe they could hold until winter. What Jodl didn't know was that just 125 miles away, 5,958 trucks were already rolling eastward in an endless convoy, headlights blazing in defiance of every military rule, carrying 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. The Red Ball Express, a logistics operation so bold that German military planners had never imagined it possible, was about to shatter every assumption about modern warfare. Within 72 hours, Patton's supposedly stranded tanks would smash through German positions at the Seine. Within a week, they'd liberate Paris. Within a month, they'd reach the German border. The Wehrmacht's best minds were about to get a brutal education in American logistics, and the teachers. 23,000 truck drivers, 75% of them African American, who turned a simple highway into the most efficient military supply line in history. Why German generals were so confident. The German general staff's confidence wasn't blind arrogance. It came from decades of experience and recent hard lessons. The Wehrmacht had pioneered blitzkrieg and mastered combined warfare. They understood intimately what military planners call the tyranny of distance. Their own campaigns had repeatedly stalled when logistics couldn't keep up with battlefield success. In Russia, the Wehrmacht's advance had initially failed not from Soviet resistance, but from the simple inability to supply forces across vast distances. German trucks broke down on Russian roads. Horse-drawn wagons, still 80% of German transport, couldn't match the speed of panzer spearheads. Railway gauge differences meant supplies piled up hundreds of miles behind the front. General Heinz von Luttwitz, who would command the 47th Panzer Corps, wrote in July, "The Americans face the same impossible logistics we faced in Russia. Their mechanical advantage becomes their weakness. Machines need fuel, ammunition, parts. They've advanced 400 miles in 30 days. History tells us what comes next. Paralysis." German intelligence meticulously tracked American consumption. A single Sherman tank burned through gas at just half a mile per gallon on roads, worse off-road. An infantry division needed 700 tons of supplies daily. An armoured division required 1,000 tons. Patton commanded 12 divisions advancing on a 60-mile front. The math seemed ironclad. 12,000 tons daily, transported 400 miles from the beaches over damaged roads through a network the Germans had systematically destroyed during their retreat. General Siegfried Westphal, soon to become Field Marshal von Rundstedt's chief of staff, calculated on August 20th. Even if the Americans had unlimited trucks, which they don't, and perfect roads, which they don't, and no breakdowns, which is impossible, they still couldn't sustain Patton's advance more than 48 hours. You can't violate the laws of physics, not even with American industry. Birth of the Impossible. Toussaint PM, August 25, 1944. A requisitioned French chateau near Laval. Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Eyre of the Motor Transport Service faced a room full of sceptical officers. The numbers were stark. Patton's Third Army was burning through supplies faster than any army in history, advancing at speeds that defied all planning. Traditional methods, railway transport, scheduled convoys, depot-to-depot distribution, had collapsed under the strain. "Gentlemen," Eyre announced, "we're creating a one-way highway from Cherbourg and the beaches straight to the front lines. Every vehicle runs 20 hours out of 24. No stopping except for gas and emergencies. We'll move a minimum of 12,500 tons daily." The name came from railroad terminology. A Red Ball freight shipment took priority over everything else. The Red Ball Express would operate the same way. Absolute priority, no delays, no exceptions. The plan defied German military doctrine in every way. 2 parallel one-way highways, one for loaded trucks going forward, one for empties returning 24-hour operations with headlights blazing, abandoning blackout discipline, no stop policy except for fuel and mechanical failure, convoys every 5 minutes, maintaining 35 mpl average mobile maintenance units every 50 miles, MP checkpoints removing any vehicle slower than 25 Landtabs. Colonel Charles Thrasher, commanding the Advanced Communications Zone, reviewed the numbers. We need 140 truck companies, 5,958 vehicles minimum, operating at 90% availability. Every logistics textbook says that's impossible. Yet within 36 hours, the impossible was operational. Rolling Thunder, August 26, 1944. Drivers from the 39th 16th Quartermaster Truck Company climbed into their GMC CCKW 212-ton trucks, nicknamed Deuce and a Half, loaded with 105mm artillery shells bound for Patton's guns at Malune, 300 miles east. The makeup of the Red Ball Express would have shocked German racial theorists. Of the 23,000 drivers who eventually operated the route, approximately 75% were African American soldiers serving in a still segregated army. These men, who couldn't eat in white restaurants or use white facilities in much of America, were keeping the most celebrated white general's army moving. The drivers created their own culture within hours. They painted slogans on their trucks: Patton's Blood Bank, Hitler, Here We Come, Detroit to Berlin Express. They made their own traffic rules. Slower vehicles pulled off immediately. Broken down trucks were pushed into ditches. Any truck below 20 ampere was considered a roadblock. By August 28th, German reconnaissance units started reporting something unprecedented. Units from Aufklärung 116 radioed from positions overlooking the main Red Ball route. Continuous vehicle column. Headlights visible for 20 kilometers. No spacing, no blackout discipline. Estimate 1,000 vehicles per hour. Americans have abandoned all military caution. This violated everything German doctrine taught. Headlights at night invited air attack. Continuous columns made perfect artillery targets. No spacing meant a single disabled truck could halt an entire convoy, yet the Americans seemed completely unconcerned. German disbelief General Edgar Feuchtinger, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, personally observed the Red Ball Express from hidden positions on August 30th. His report to Army Group B headquarters reflected growing alarm. The enemy operates a supply system beyond our understanding. Vehicles pass at 30-second intervals day and night without pause. They don't hide, don't disperse, don't follow any rules we recognize. This isn't military science. It's mass production applied to warfare. What the Germans couldn't grasp was that American logistics worked on completely different principles. Where German doctrine emphasized hiding, Americans relied on volume. Where Germans conserved vehicles, Americans assumed 20% failure rates and planned accordingly. Where Germans followed strict procedures, Americans improvised constantly. The numbers achieved by the Red Ball Express defied every German calculation. First week, August 25-31, 1944. 89,139 tons delivered daily average, 12,848 tons. Round trip distance, 686 miles. Vehicle rotations, 5,958 trucks making 1.5 trips daily. Fuel consumed by the operation itself, 300,000 gallons. German logistics specialists captured these numbers from American documents and dismissed them as propaganda. But they were real, and accelerating. The system that shouldn't work. By September 5th, the Red Ball Express had established a rhythm that seemed physically impossible to German officers still relying on horse-drawn wagons for 80% of their transport. Convoys departing every 5 minutes from the western end average convoy. 67 vehicles load per vehicle, 5 tons standard, 7 tons with frequent overloading. Time to cover 350 miles one way. 14 hours average. Turnaround time at each end. 2 hours. Vehicles in constant motion, 5,000 at any given moment. The Red Ball Express sparked innovations every hour as drivers and mechanics solved problems German military science considered unsolvable. When trucks broke down, approximately 1,800 daily, mobile maintenance units performed roadside repairs. Mechanics developed a triage system, 15 minutes to fix it or push it off the road. Parts were scavenged from vehicles deemed beyond repair. Engines were swapped in 45 minutes using mobile cranes. When the designated Red Ball route got congested, Drivers created alternatives. They commandeered French buses to move personnel and free up cargo trucks. They captured German vehicles, painted them olive drab, and pressed them into service. They built bypasses around destroyed bridges using rubble from bombed buildings as roadbed. The Germans, watching this chaos somehow produce order, couldn't process it. German doctrine emphasized careful planning, maintenance schedules, proper procedures. The Americans violated every principle, yet their system accelerated instead of collapsing. The fuel miracle. The most stunning revelation for German observers was American fuel management. The Red Bull Express consumed 300,000 gallons of gasoline daily just for its own operations, more than many entire German armies received for all purposes. Yet fuel never ran short. The Americans had created a parallel marvel, Operation Pluto, pipelines under the ocean, laying fuel pipelines across the English Channel. By September 1944, fuel flowed through underwater pipes German intelligence hadn't even detected. Forward fuel dumps were established every 25 miles along the Red Bull route. Tanker trucks ran their own parallel convoy system, ensuring no vehicle waited more than 10 minutes for refueling. General Walter Warlimont observed from aerial photos, "The Americans have fuel dumps larger than our entire strategic reserves. They burn more gasoline moving gasoline than we allocate to entire panzer divisions. This isn't war as we understand it, it's industrial overflow. Speed beyond comprehension." The Red Bull Express didn't just supply Patton's advance, it multiplied its speed exponentially. German doctrine calculated that an armoured division could sustain 20-30 miles of advance daily under optimal conditions. Patton's divisions, supplied by the Red Bull Express, averaged 40-60 miles daily for weeks. On September 1, 1944, the 4th Armoured Division advanced 35 miles in morning operations, halted for resupply at noon. Red Bull trucks were waiting with fuel and ammunition, then advanced another 32 miles in the afternoon. This 67-mile single-day advance shattered German defensive planning, which assumed maximum 30-mile daily advances. General Heinz Guderian, reviewing reports in East Prussia, initially refused to believe them. No armoured force can advance 60 miles daily for a week. Mechanical failures alone prevent it. This is propaganda or misidentification. But intercepted American radio traffic confirmed it. More disturbing for German commanders, the Americans were broadcasting their positions openly without code, supremely confident they could move faster than Germans could react. The breaking point of German military science. By September 5, 1944, German intelligence had compiled comprehensive reports on the Red Bull Express. The implications were catastrophic for Wehrmacht planning. Every assumption about American military capability required revision. The reports contained observations that defied German military science. Americans abandoned damaged trucks rather than repairing them. Waste on an unimaginable scale. Drivers operated on stimulants for days, violating every principle of personnel management. No camouflage discipline, making the entire system vulnerable to air attacks that never came. Mechanical failure rates of 30% daily. Simply overwhelmed by redundancy fuel consumption that would bankrupt any European military Field Marshal Walter Model's response revealed growing desperation. If these reports are accurate, we face not a superior army but a superior civilization. They make no effort to hide because they don't fear us. They waste resources because they have infinite resources. We cannot defeat this with military tactics. The human cost. The Red Bull Express drivers paid a physical price German observers couldn't see. Drivers operated for 72 hours straight, hallucinating from exhaustion and benzodrine. Accidents killed 300 drivers during the operation. Trucks collided in fog, overturned on damaged roads, burst into flames when overheated engines ignited. Yet morale remained extraordinarily high. These men, mostly African American, denied equal rights at home, understood they were making history. They were proving Hitler's racial theories wrong with every mile driven, every ton delivered. Captured German officers provided eloquent testimony to the Red Bull Express's impact. Oberst Hans von Luck, taken prisoner in September 1944, told interrogators, "We knew we'd lost when we understood your supply system. You violate every rule, waste fuel, abandon vehicles, exhaust drivers, yet succeed through sheer volume. You've industrialized warfare beyond our comprehension." The psychological impact on German forces was devastating. Wehrmacht soldiers could hear American trucks all night, every night. Endless motors, endless supplies. They had 3 rounds per rifle while Americans shipped in millions. The sound itself became psychological warfare. American steel, American innovation. The vehicles themselves amazed German engineers. The GMC CCCKW2 1 2-ton truck, backbone of the Red Ball Express, represented mass production perfection. General Motors had produced over 500,000 of these vehicles by war's end, more trucks than the entire German military possessed of all types combined. The trucks featured innovations Germans hadn't implemented: all-wheel drive as standard, not exception automatic tyre inflation systems, waterproofing that allowed 30-inch Fording engines that ran on low-quality fuel without modification, heaters that actually worked in winter. Even more stunning was American maintenance philosophy. Where Germans rebuilt engines, Americans replaced them. Where Germans rationed parts, Americans discarded entire vehicles for minor problems. Where Germans had master mechanics, Americans had thousands of competent mechanics who could perform 80% of repairs. Infinite adaptation. As the front moved east, the Red Ball Express adapted with speed that stunned German planning officers accustomed to weeks of preparation for major logistics changes. When the original route to Chartres became insufficient, Americans created Red Ball Express extensions overnight. White Ball Express, Rouen to Paris, Green Diamond, Cherbourg to railroad transfer points, Red Lion, Bayeux to Brussels, ABC, Antwerp, Brussels, Charleroi. Each new route was operational within 48 hours of conception. German staff officers required weeks to plan similar operations. Americans simply painted new markers, assigned trucks, and started rolling. Shattering Nazi ideology. The predominance of African American drivers created cognitive dissonance for German racial theorists. Nazi ideology declared black people inferior, incapable of technical tasks, lacking initiative. Yet these drivers were performing logistics miracles German forces couldn't match. The African American soldiers understood the irony perfectly. They knew what the Nazis thought of them, which made them drive even harder. Every mile they drove proved Hitler wrong. They were fighting racism with truck keys, defeating Nazi ideology through superior performance. Some German prisoners, forced to work as labourers loading Red Bull trucks, found their worldview shattered. They worked alongside African American sergeants who calculated weight distributions faster than German engineers, spoke better English than German instructors, and treated prisoners fairly despite everything Nazi propaganda had told them about racial behaviour. Engineering the impossible. The Red Ball Express required infrastructure Germans deemed impossible to create under combat conditions. 40 bridges built or reinforced 15 major fuel depots, created 26 maintenance stations, established 8 temporary cities constructed for drivers, all while the operation was running at full speed. The bridge at Monte had been destroyed by German engineers specifically to halt American logistics. The Wehrmacht calculated replacement would require 6 weeks minimum. American engineers built a temporary bridge in 14 hours while Red Bull convoys detoured only 8 miles on hastily bulldozed bypass roads. German engineers observed American construction methods with amazement. No planning meetings, no detailed blueprints, just immediate action. Americans built faster than Germans could destroy. Artillery without limits. 1. Red Ball. Express achievement particularly stunned German artillery officers. Ammunition supply rates that exceeded their highest theoretical calculations. American artillery units fired without restriction, a luxury no German unit had enjoyed since 1942. During the reduction of Metz fortifications in September 1944, the 19th Corps artillery fired 100,000 rounds in 24 hours. The Red Ball Express delivered every round plus 20% surplus. German artillery defending Metz was rationed to 50 rounds per gun per day. The disparity was overwhelming. American guns fired continuously for hours. German artillery officers calculated that such bombardments required 50 truckloads of ammunition per hour. The Red Bull provided it without pause. Consuming victory. The Red Bull Express consumed vehicles at rates that would have paralysed any other military. By late September, mechanical attrition reached staggering levels. Average vehicle life, 10,000 miles, normal 30,000, daily deadline rate, 30% of all vehicles' engines replaced, 500 weekly tyres consumed, 10,000 weekly total vehicles destroyed or abandoned, 5,000 plus. Yet the operation never slowed. American production had anticipated such losses. Ships arrived weekly at French ports carrying hundreds of new trucks. Replacement drivers were trained in 2 days and thrown into convoys. German calculations showed Americans destroying more trucks weekly than the Wehrmacht possessed in France. Yet American transport capacity increased rather than decreased. They had achieved something Germans thought impossible: logistics faster than consumption. Hearts and minds. French civilians along the Red Bull route witnessed American abundance that contradicted years of German occupation scarcity. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Red Bull Express drivers, particularly African Americans, often shared their rations with French civilians despite regulations. At every stop, children would gather and drivers would give them chocolate, cigarettes, soap. The contrast with German occupation was stark. Americans gave away casually what Germans had rationed strictly. German intelligence reported the propaganda impact. French civilians now believe American victory is inevitable. They cite the truck convoys as proof. Resistance activity has increased 400% along Red Bull routes. The population that accepted our occupation now actively opposes it. The crisis that wasn't early September 1944. The Red Bull Express faced its greatest challenge. Patton's Third Army had advanced so far that even the Red Bull struggled to maintain supply rates. Round trips now exceeded 700 miles. Drivers were collapsing, vehicles were disintegrating. German intelligence detected the strain. General Hasso von Manteuffel reported September 8th. American supply lines show signs of collapse. Convoy intervals have increased from 5 to 15 minutes. Vehicle speed has decreased. This is our opportunity. But American adaptability again surprised the Germans. Within 72 hours, the Red Bull Express reorganized, created intermediate transfer points, cutting individual runs to 350 miles, implemented driver rotation systems, established forward maintenance bases, doubled the number of assigned vehicles. By September 12th, tonnage delivery had actually increased. The crisis that should have halted Patton only made the system stronger. Victory by air. Supplementing the Red Bull Express, Americans implemented another solution. Germans deemed impossible: large-scale aerial supply. C-47 transport aircraft began delivering critical supplies directly to forward units, each carrying 3 tons. On September 16, 1944, Wehrmacht observers counted 900 transport flights in a single day, delivering 2,700 tons by air. The Luftwaffe at its peak had managed 300 tons daily to Stalingrad, and considered that a maximum effort. The Americans used transport aircraft like trucks. No concerns about fighter escorts, no fuel limitations. They assumed losses and overwhelmed them with numbers. The Wehrmacht couldn't compete with this industrial arithmetic. Leadership without hierarchy. The Red Bull Express operated under command principles that violated German military hierarchy. Junior officers made decisions reserved for generals in the Wehrmacht. Sergeants commanded operations larger than German colonels managed. This decentralization baffled German observers. American logistics operated without apparent central control. Every lieutenant acted like a general, every sergeant like a colonel. Chaos should have resulted. Instead, they achieved efficiency the Wehrmacht couldn't match with rigid hierarchy. The final statistics. By October 1944, advancing rail lines began reducing Red Bull Express requirements. The operation that was supposed to last 10 days had continued for 82 days, delivering 412,000 tons of supplies over 122 million ton miles. German commanders, now fighting on their own borders, reflected on what they'd witnessed. Field Marshal Model wrote in his final report, "We were not defeated primarily by American tanks or planes. We were defeated by American trucks. The Red Bull Express proved that in modern war, logistics is strategy." Final Red Bull Express. Statistics: 82 days of operation, 412,193 tons of supplies, delivered 222 million ton miles, 5,958 vehicles average, peak 7,000. 23,000 total drivers, employed 700,000 gallons of fuel consumed daily, 40,000 tons of ammunition delivered to Patton alone, 15 million rations transported 135,000 tons of medical supplies. Reviewing these figures in captivity, German officers admitted they had calculated American logistics based on European precedent. They had multiplied their best performance by 3 and assumed that was the American maximum. They were wrong by a factor of 10. Breaking more than military lines. Beyond tonnage and distance, the Red Ball Express achieved something more profound. It destroyed German faith in their own military superiority. Wehrmacht officers who had dismissed Americans as soft and mechanically dependent watched those same Americans achieve logistics miracles through determination and industrial abundance. German prisoners of war would stand silent at prison camp fences, counting passing Red Bull trucks. Some wept. They understood what it meant, not just that Americans could supply their armies, but that they could waste more than Germans could produce. They were watching their worldview collapse, one truck at a time. An unexpected reckoning. The Red Ball Express forced an unexpected racial reckoning within the American military itself. The operation's success depended overwhelmingly on African American soldiers who were still segregated, denied equal treatment, and barred from combat roles. General Eisenhower, visiting Red Ball operations in September 1944, witnessed the contradiction firsthand. His aide, Captain Harry Butcher, recorded, "The general stood watching coloured drivers who'd been at it for 20 hours straight. He said, 'These men are winning the war as surely as any infantry. We need to reconsider many things.'" The success created pressure for integration that contributed to military desegregation 3 years later. African American soldiers had proved in France what they always knew. Given the tools and opportunity, they would match anyone. The Red Ball was their combat, and they won it decisively. Lessons learned. Two late German military engineers studied Red Ball Express operations intensively after the war. The lessons revolutionized logistics thinking worldwide. Volume overcomes inefficiency, mechanical redundancy, eliminates vulnerability, decentralized execution, enables speed, standardization, multiplies capability. Human endurance has limits, but they're higher than assumed General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, wrote in 1950. The Red Ball Express proved logistics determined strategy, not vice versa. Americans understood this. We learned it too late. Heroes without recognition. Among the 23,000 Red Ball drivers, individual stories of heroism emerged, verified accounts from military records. Corporal John L. Euston drove continuously for 48 hours delivering ammunition to the 2nd Armoured Division at Cambrai, falling asleep at the wheel 3 times but continuing after other drivers revived him. Private Booker T. Washington's truck caught fire from overheated brakes while carrying medical supplies. Instead of abandoning it as procedure required, he drove the burning vehicle 2 miles to a field hospital, jumping out as flames reached the cab. The supplies saved wounded soldiers from both armies. These stories, multiplied thousands of times, revealed American military culture to German observers. Individual initiative, calculated risk-taking, mission accomplishment over regulatory compliance. The German copy that failed desperately, German forces attempted to create their own Red Ball Express in late 1944. Operation Greif during the Battle of the Bulge included plans for captured American trucks to create German supply lines. The effort failed immediately. German drivers couldn't maintain American speeds, German mechanics couldn't repair American equipment fast enough, German fuel supplies couldn't sustain the consumption rates. Most fundamentally, Germans couldn't replicate the American attitude of unlimited resources. Oberstleutnant commanding the operation reported, "We captured 50 American trucks. Within a week, 30 were broken down. Americans would have replaced them. We tried to repair them. That difference explains our defeat." Winter warriors. The winter of 1944-45 provided the Red Ball Express's ultimate test. Freezing rain, snow, and ice should have stopped wheeled transport. German doctrine stated wheeled logistics became impossible below Rotenburg. Yet the Red Ball Express continued. Drivers wrapped chains on tyres, poured alcohol in radiators, and kept rolling. Speeds dropped from 35 to 15 NEM, but tonnage delivery continued. German observers reported ice-covered convoys moving through blizzards that had stopped panzer divisions. The Americans had created a logistics system that functioned regardless of weather, terrain, or enemy action. It wasn't elegant or efficient by German standards, but it was unstoppable. Aftermath and Legacy. In May 1945, captured German logistics officers were required to study Red Ball Express operations for historical records. Their conclusions were unanimous and devastating to German military pride. General Friedrich Schulz summarized, "The Red Ball Express represents warfare we never imagined. Americans created a temporary civilization, thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, millions of tons, that existed only to feed armies, then dissolved when no longer needed. We built permanent infrastructure over years. They created superior temporary systems in days." The most insightful analysis came from General Heinz Guderian, father of German armoured warfare. "We invented blitzkrieg but never solved its fundamental limitation, logistics. Americans solved it through industrial excess we deemed impossible. The Red Ball Express was not a supply line but a flowing river of material that drowned our forces. The real cost of victory." The Red Ball Express cost the United States approximately $100 million in 1944 dollars. Vehicles destroyed, fuel consumed, roads, damaged French compensation claims. German staff officers, accustomed to managing scarcity, found the figure incomprehensible. Yet Americans considered it cheap. The operation enabled capture of 400,000 German soldiers, liberation of France, Belgium and Luxembourg, shortened the war by an estimated 6 months. Each day of war cost America $250 million. The Red Ball Express paid for itself in a single day of shortened conflict. Building post-war America. An unexpected consequence of the Red Ball Express was its revolutionary impact on post-war civilian logistics. Thousands of drivers returned to America with experience operating the world's largest transportation network. These veterans founded trucking companies, designed interstate highways, and created the modern American logistics industry. Companies like Yellow Freight, Roadway, and Consolidated Freightways were started by Red Bull veterans who applied military logistics to civilian commerce. They had learned in France that volume beats efficiency, speed beats perfection, and if you can keep trucks rolling 24 hours, you can move the world. The moment everything changed. On September 15, 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Supreme German Commander in the West, received comprehensive intelligence on the Red Ball Express. After studying the reports for hours, he summoned his staff. "Gentlemen," he announced, "we face something beyond military solution. The Americans have created a supply system that makes distance irrelevant. Our strategy assumed a culminating point where advancing forces outrun supplies. That point doesn't exist. They have revolutionized warfare, and we are fighting the last war." His operations officer suggested attacking the Red Ball routes with remaining Luftwaffe forces. Von Rundstedt's response revealed complete understanding. "With what shall we attack? They have 6,000 trucks. If we destroyed 1,000, which we cannot, they'd replace them in a week. We'd need to destroy 200 trucks daily just to match their production. We don't have 200 aircraft total." The sound of defeat. Behind the statistics were human stories that revealed American character to German observers. Drivers who hadn't slept for 3 days refusing relief because their trucks might not make it through. Mechanics working in freezing rain to keep convoys rolling. Teenagers lying about their age to drive trucks. Such stories, multiplied throughout the operation, created a mythology that demoralized German forces. The Americans were not soft as propaganda claimed. They drove themselves harder than Germans drove horses, but voluntarily, not from fear. This made them more dangerous than German doctrine had understood. The Red Ball Express became unintentional propaganda, more powerful than any planned operation. German soldiers could hear the convoys at night, endless streams of motors that never stopped. The sound itself became psychological warfare. American psychological warfare units recognized the impact. They began broadcasting truck engine sounds toward German lines when actual convoys weren't present. German units reported these phantom convoys as real, demonstrating the psychological damage the Red Ball Express had inflicted. Rapid dissolution. In November 1944, with rail lines partially restored, the Red Ball Express was officially discontinued. But its methods had permanently revolutionized military logistics. The final innovation was the speed of dissolution. The massive operation, 23,000 men, 6,000 vehicles, hundreds of installations, disappeared in 72 hours. Troops reassigned, vehicles redistributed, routes returned to civilian use. Germans required months to create smaller operations and years to dissolve them. Americans built what they needed, used it, discarded it, and built something better. The verdict of history. When German generals surrendered in May 1945, many cited the Red Ball Express specifically as demonstrating the hopelessness of continued resistance. General Hasso von Manteuffel stated at his interrogation, "When we understood your logistics capacity, we knew the war was lost. You could supply armies faster than we could destroy them. The Red Ball Express was a weapon against which we had no defence." Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, among Germany's most competent commanders, was asked what most surprised him about American forces. His answer, "Not your tanks, not your planes, but your trucks. The Red Ball Express showed us that you had militarized your entire society's production capacity. We were fighting your factories, not just your soldiers." Final reckoning. The numbers tell a story that transcended military operations, the moment when warfare changed forever, when industrial capacity became more important than tactical brilliance, when logistics determined strategy rather than serving it. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, the United States Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp honouring the Red Ball Express. Veterans who attended the ceremony spoke of their pride in an operation that had been overshadowed by combat but proved equally decisive. They had driven through exhaustion, through mechanical failure, through weather that stopped armour. They were black soldiers mostly, segregated, discriminated against, denied recognition during the war. But they had delivered victory at 35 Villasconnais, the truth history must record. In his memoirs, General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was the primary beneficiary of the Red Ball Express, wrote the ultimate tribute. "The truck drivers of the Red Ball Express deserve as much credit for the defeat of Germany as any combat unit. They drove through exhaustion, through mechanical failure, through weather that stopped armour. Without them, the Third Army doesn't move. Without movement, we don't win. They were black soldiers mostly, segregated, discriminated against, denied recognition. But they won the war as surely as any rifleman." History must record this truth. That truth stands as the final testament to the Red Ball Express. 23,000, mostly African-American drivers operating 6,000 trucks on a one-way highway to victory, achieved what German military science declared impossible. They supplied advancing armies faster than physics should allow, maintained tempo beyond human endurance, and proved that in modern warfare, the side with the most trucks beats the side with the best tactics. The German generals had laughed at American logistics, dismissing it as wasteful, undisciplined, impossible to sustain. 82 days later, those same generals surrendered to armies supplied by the Red Ball Express, finally understanding that American trucks had defeated German tanks, that industrial abundance had overwhelmed military excellence, that logistics had become strategy. The highway to victory. The Red Ball Express ended on November 16, 1944, but its impact echoed through military history. It proved that in the industrial age, victory belongs not to the bravest soldiers or brightest generals, but to the nation that can deliver the most supplies, the fastest, the farthest. The highways of France still bear the scars, ruts worn by overloaded trucks, bridges hastily repaired, roadsides once littered with abandoned vehicles. But the greatest monument to the operation is the speed of Allied victory. Every day the war shortened saved thousands of lives. The Red Ball Express shortened it by months. The last word. The last word belongs to a German officer whose name is lost to history, quoted by a Red Ball driver at the 1994 commemoration. Standing beside a road in Belgium, watching the endless convoy of American trucks, the officer said in accented English to his captors, "We prepared for everything. Your tanks, your planes, your ships. We never prepared for your trucks. How do you defeat an enemy who has more trucks than you have soldiers?" The answer rolled past him at 5-minute intervals, driven by exhausted Americans who were rewriting the rules of warfare, one delivery at a time. The Red Ball Express had made logistics into strategy, supply into victory, and trucks into the most decisive weapon of the European war. The German generals stopped laughing when they understood this truth. But by then, Patton was already at their gates, supplied by the greatest logistics operation in military history.